It's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
We are witnessing the rise of nationalism, protectionism, the pursuit of narrow interests, and the decline of common cause. This is the world that we, as South Africa, a developing economy, must now navigate. But we are not daunted to navigate our path through this world that constantly changes. We will not be deterred. We are, as South Africans, a resilient people, and we will not be bullied. We are concerned about the potential impact of the decision by the United States government to suspend some of its funding for HIV and TB programs in African countries.
Canada backs South Africa's G20 leadership amid U.S.-South Africa tension. The G20 is one of the most influential economic forums in the world, shaping policies that impact global trade, development, and diplomacy. With tensions rising between the United States and South Africa, Canada has stepped in to support South Africa's leadership within the G20, signaling a shift in global alliances. This move comes at a time when the balance of power is shifting, with emerging economies demanding a greater say in global affairs. South Africa, as the only African nation in the G20, has been pushing for reforms that would give the Global South more representation in global governance. However, its recent foreign policy decisions, particularly its stance on Russia, BRICS, and Israel-Palestine, have placed it at odds with the United States. Canada's decision to back South Africa highlights its own strategic goals of supporting multilateralism while maintaining influence in the developing world. Canada and South Africa have a complex history that dates back to the apartheid era, when Canada strongly opposed the racial segregation policies enforced by the South African government. Canada played a crucial role in sanctions against apartheid South Africa during the 1980s, cutting economic ties and supporting global efforts to isolate the regime. After Nelson Mandela's release and South Africa's transition to democracy, Canada became one of South Africa's key allies in development, trade, and diplomacy. In the post-apartheid era, Canada and South Africa have continued their cooperation through the Commonwealth, United Nations, and G20. While not as close as during the Mandela years, Canada has positioned itself as a partner in Africa's development, investing in industries like mining, education, and technology. Supporting South Africa's leadership in the G20 aligns with Canada's broader foreign policy strategy of engaging with the Global South to counter growing influence from China and Russia. The relationship between South Africa and the United States has always been shaped by strategic and ideological factors. During apartheid, the U.S. maintained a complicated stance, officially condemning apartheid, but continuing economic ties with the white minority government for strategic Cold War reasons. After apartheid ended, relations improved significantly, with the U.S. providing aid, trade agreements, and military cooperation. However, under successive South African governments, tensions have emerged over foreign policy disagreements. One of the biggest shifts came as South Africa deepened its ties with BRICS, a bloc seen as a counterweight to U.S. and Western dominance. South Africa's neutral stance on Russia's war in Ukraine, its criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, and its increasing alignment with China have all contributed to deteriorating relations with Washington. More recently, South Africa's vocal support for Palestinian rights in the Israel-Gaza conflict has further strained relations with the United States. President Donald Trump is taking a hardline stance against South Africa's land expropriation policies, which sought to redistribute land from white farmers to black South Africans. Trump's administration accused the policy of threatening property rights and cut U.S. aid funding to South Africa as a result. This move was part of a broader strategy to pressure South Africa to align more closely with U.S. economic interests and policies. South Africa, however, viewed the aid cut as an example of U.S. interference in its domestic policies and remained committed to land reform. Trump's administration maintained a firm stance, arguing that U.S. aid should not support policies that undermine property rights and investor confidence. Canada, by contrast, has not imposed such economic restrictions, instead opting for a more cooperative approach to South Africa's leadership in the G20. One of the biggest sources of friction between the United States and South Africa is their divergent foreign policy positions. The U.S. has been frustrated by South Africa's refusal to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while South Africa has criticized the West's double standards on human rights issues. South Africa has also been deepening its trade and military cooperation with China, challenging the U.S.'s influence in Africa. The U.S. has responded by warning South Africa of economic consequences, including threats to revoke South Africa's access to the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a trade deal that gives African countries preferential access to U.S. markets. South Africa, however, has not backed down and continues to assert its independent foreign policy. This growing rift has made Canada's support even more significant, as it signals that some Western countries are willing to engage with South Africa despite U.S. opposition. Another major development heightening U.S.-South Africa tensions is South Africa's genocide case against Israel, referred to here as the Zionist entity, at the International Court of Justice. South Africa has accused Israel of committing acts of genocide in Gaza, a move that has led to strong backlash from the U.S. and its allies. Washington has denounced the case as politically motivated and has pressured South Africa to withdraw its complaint. However, South Africa has remained firm, arguing that its case is based on international law and human rights principles. This legal action has pushed South Africa further away from the U.S. and closer to nations in the global South that are critical of Israel's policies. Canada's decision to continue engaging with South Africa despite this controversy highlights its different approach to international diplomacy compared to the U.S. Unlike the U.S., Canada has taken a more diplomatic approach to South Africa's leadership in the G20. Canada has long positioned itself as a country that values multilateralism and dialogue, making it more open to engaging with South Africa despite its growing ties to BRICS. Canada also sees South Africa as a key gateway to Africa, a continent that is becoming increasingly important in global trade and investment. By backing South Africa's leadership, Canada is also reinforcing its own standing within the G20. As U.S. influence faces challenges from both within and outside the bloc, Canada sees an opportunity to act as a mediator between Western nations and emerging economies. Supporting South Africa allows Canada to strengthen its ties with Africa while maintaining credibility as a global power broker. Canada's decision to back South Africa's leadership in the G20 comes at a crucial time when global power dynamics are shifting. As the U.S. tightens its stance against countries that don't align with its foreign policy, Canada is taking a more pragmatic approach, engaging with emerging economies rather than isolating them. This move could help Canada build stronger ties with Africa and other members of the Global South, giving it a greater role in shaping global economic policies. In the long run, this could reshape the balance of power within the G20. If more Western nations follow Canada's lead in working with South Africa and other BRICS-aligned countries, it could weaken U.S. dominance in global governance. Whether this leads to a more inclusive global order or increased fragmentation remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: South Africa's role in the G20 is becoming more important than ever.
Opportunity too to promote greater collaboration between African nations and the rest of the world. But it is also a great opportunity for all of us as members of the G20 and invited countries to engage in serious dialogue